So 1977 is when the Mekons formed, 10 years before I was born. So like, try and colour it in maybe a little bit for me. I know. Stature, We Are the Champions by Queen came out. Rumours by Fleetwood Mac came out and all that. I think the Ford Fiesta was out that year.
You've been on Wikipedia, haven't you?
A few, yeah, bits, well, asking my dad basically what was going on around that time. He's a bit of his own Wikipedia, but yeah, so try and colour it in for me a little bit if possible, and for people in the audience who weren't here at the time.
It was such a different place then. I mean, to go back to
Leeds, it was a dump.
It was a shithole, yeah.
Everything was black, wasn't it?
Everywhere it's been knocked down, everywhere was dirty, there was nothing to do.
Yeah, we were all fucking bastards. None of us had a job.
It was motorway city of the 70s though.
And, I mean, nothing happened. Nothing. It was a desert.
I don't know, we had to
Hang
be
on,
several
hang on.
yeah.
Hang on, when you say it was a desert, it also had like a vibrant art school that working class kids went to, and mixed with other kids, and I think that's like a vital thing for Leeds.
Well, I was about to say.
Sorry.
One of the only things that this was before the punk thing happened. One of the only things me, an art student up at the uni, was going on a Wednesday night to a disco on the Heaven and Hell, and we met the poly students there, and they were, compared to what we were doing at the university, it was such a breath of fresh air, and they were so exciting, and the friendship came out of that, and that was a breeding ground, and out of that came the Scritties and Mark Ormond and Soft Cell, so that was exciting, but other than that, it was collecting the empties on a Sunday morning and taking them to the offie to get a bottle of cider. And that was pretty good going.
But the city was full of politics at that time. Did you not notice any of that?
Well, no, not directly, although we're aware of the Free School and aware of the Leeds on the paper, or Northern Star as it was in those days, was it?
It became Northern Star.
No, they become the Northern Star, so they got hitched.
Right. And there was, it's funny because we were talking about that a while ago. It was in the air we breathed, but I came to Leeds as a student in '74, so I was young, I didn't know what was what. So it was completely normal to me that there was that kind of radicalism around. I was surprised that it wasn't the same in other places. But that definitely informed, just getting...
I take it for granted. I moved to London for 24 years after 1980, but I thought that everywhere was going to be like Leeds, and people were surprised to me that it won't.
All my mates worked in court. I moved in '82, and there were cooperatives all over Leeds.
Yeah.
So, you bought your food in a cooperative, you worked in a warehouse cooperative, you got your shoes made, unfortunately, by a cooperative. You sort of, you controlled your labour in a way. You don't know if you wanted, a lot of the people I'm looking at in this room, if they wanted something to happen, then they found an old building and they opened it. And so there'd be a women's centre for a week, or a squat in the old rates building for a week. God knows what we did when we, you would put music on and things, but it had a alternative culture and was small enough for you to know everyone. And then you had the music scene and hit bands on top.
Paul hit on something earlier, like you mentioned the Ripper, and the Ripper had a big effect on gigs as well at that time. And women were afraid to go out on their own. So like the majority of the crowd were like young lads, and there were quite a few hunkettes, if you excuse the expression, around, but they were like the brave ones, the ones who...
Yeah, in your club and ours that they were, but I don't think they were very much elsewhere.
Yeah, and it got to a point where Leeds was coming to a standstill. They stopped running the late night buses.
That's
because
right, that's all.
women weren't coming into town. Guys used to come into town to pick up women in the clubs, but there were no women there, so they stopped coming to the clubs, and then they stopped running the late night buses, all because of one man.
It always felt like the city was under curfew.
Yeah.
It was dark. I always remember seeing City Square, but it was dark and there's nobody in it about 11 o'clock at night.
I remember down the F Club when it was at Brannigan's, I had New Order on, and it was their first gig outside Manchester since Ian Curtis died. And I wasn't allowed to mention they were Joy Division, but if you don't know who they are, don't bother coming. And so people made it a business to know. But on that day, the day of the gig, they announced that they caught the Ripper, and the place was packed, it was jam-packed.
Well, the police actually issued a curfew. They told women to not go out after dark. That was the response to the Ripper.
So there was this kind of ominous crowd over Leeds, over going out in the evening in Leeds at that time.
Definitely.
But isn't that where the women's taxi service started out from? Anybody remember that? Anybody familiar with
I think
that?
from Leeds Uni they did one.
Yeah, from Leeds Uni. The women's group at Leeds Uni used to run a minibus. But I mean, yeah, it must have been a response to that. And but lots of self-defence classes in Leeds could kill you with 2 fingers.
So the women weren't at gigs too much, maybe during that time, but
they were after.
No, I'm not saying there weren't any women, but it kind of stopped a few more who would have come.
Well, this reminds me of that joke. What's a Yorkshire woman's definition of being lazy? Glassing you with an half pint.
Yeah. It wasn't just that, it's their parents wouldn't let them go out either, because of the Ripper. He did have a sort of real hold, over Leeds at that time, because it just got more and more.
Every time there was another one.
There was another one, and it got
Body
more.
found.
It's like, and 17-year-olds wanted to go to gigs. The parents would say, "You're not going out on your own. You're not going," and whatever. They were worried.
so did that affect the women musicians? Or
No, it was I had a great gig with the Slits when they first started at Leeds Poly, and I don't think women bands from outside of Leeds didn't know about that. They weren't bothered, So, we had loads of bands like the Raincoats, Kleenex from Switzerland, and lots. So there were a lot of female bands around, but not necessarily a large female audience.
And that can have a knock-on effect. I mean, we get asked about it quite a lot, like about feminism and women being encouraged to play music, but that's a very acute symptom of, and it'll probably influence an answer I give in the future about like why women aren't in music so much.
One of the most
But
popular
that's such a deterrent.
punk bands of the time was Blondie, fronted by a woman, so there wasn't any prejudice, against women there. It just wasn't. There weren't as many women, I think, as there should have been. It was male dominated.
I think when you say there weren't any prejudice, we weren't, and I think still aren't, living in an entirely equal world, and it was a lot less equal at that point.
Yeah.
You could be somebody in a band's girlfriend. That was that was the thing you did.
Yeah.
And then it was that extra jump to actually being in a band that were different.
But I think there were quite a few then around that because the music changed.
Well,
that's the whole thing.
And the culture changed. And you got to, I think Leeds is quite a
there was Shady and the Boys, the Butterflies, there was Delta 5, there was Claire from the F Club, the DJ.
I was going to mention Delta 5 because they were involved in Rock Against Racism.
Yeah, they were.
Au pairs.
Au pairs came
their au pairs were good. But people used to travel to go and see au pairs. It weren't like they were. We're making it sound like there were women's bands coming out of every orifice, and there weren't.
No, there weren't. But there were some significant ones, weren't there?
Yeah, but you did actually,
These weren't women. A lot of them weren't women's bands. A lot of women in bands.
I mean, I was obviously not in Leeds at that time, but you noticed au pairs not just because they were one of the few bands that came through the opening with Punk Elaborate, because they were writing explicitly feminist. Like you said, there were a lot of bands where maybe the girls could graduate from girlfriend to bass player.
Yeah.
But au pairs were sort of like an explicitly feminist band in punk, which wasn't really happening.
Well, Leslie Woods were a great lyricist as well, and it weren't just a female singer, so you had Jane, whatever she was called, on bass, and there were
Paul and the au pairs were. A lot of us were friends, and even though the au pairs were from Birmingham, they'd been big friends of mine, and I used to live in this fucking hellhole of an house in Airels that basically dropped to bits. The neighbours had petitions against us all the time because it was, you remember, you fucking live there. it was dropping to bits that we had red flags out the window. We were surprised why we got a brick through it every Friday night. But, you know, Ian Curtis slept on my sofa there. The au pairs were never out of the house. You lot were never away from the frigging parties. These people there all the time, and we talked about all this. It's just our whole life is talking about things. And when we put our gigs on, we just didn't put gigs on. We did politicise the whole thing. We'd if it was St Patrick's Day, we'd do things for Troops Out. Around Gay Pride, we did stuff. We did stuff on International Women's Day, for National Abortion Campaign, all sorts of issues that were going around. We did this not regularly. It wasn't one-off, we did it regularly. All the time. The whole thing was themed. The whole thing at Rocking Space was very colourful, lots of very colourful banners and posters and badges. And if it was a room like this, all the walls would be, you'd be going blind looking at them. I remember, yeah. But we expressly did all that. So we talked about it all the time.
Isn't that called propaganda?
Yeah, you can call it whatever you like, yeah.
Can I ask?
Yeah. But that's your point of it.
I know.
Yeah.
With the Mekons and the Leeds music scene, I know that we survived because we had the same money. We didn't have personal money. All the money we had went into the band and to live with each other. Did you sort of do that? Because money seemed to be the least important thing about being in a band for us for a long time.
We didn't pool the money because there wasn't any money to pool. there was just dole.
Yeah. We pulled our dole. We just put all our dole in a big pot.
Yeah.
And then you got out what you needed.
Yeah, I think you were much more organised than us and took things to a much more interesting stage than we did.
We had our own clothes.
I think we pulled each other as well, mostly. But, I mean, we pulled the rehearsal room with Del 5 and the Gang of Four, and our infamous PA, which the bass bins were so big you couldn't actually get them in the van that we bought to take the PA round in. So there was, and you were talking about co-ops, and you were talking about co-ops, and there was that in the air, but it was more almost, it wasn't lip service, but it wasn't sort of hardline, well organised, because we were musicians.
It's more like the young ones.
Yeah, it was a lot more like the young kids, and you know, there was drugs to take and gigs to play. So it wasn't as well organised as you lot were. I always admired you for that and thought, oh, well, we could manage that, but we never could. We could never quite get ourselves together in that way. But the spirit was there, definitely. And the feeling that the commonality was the right way to go forward.
Yeah.
And it was like and that would reach out in interesting ways to bands that didn't necessarily feel the same way as you did. Great.
The Explorers.
Well, bringing Grape into it, you're talking about the university bands like the Mekons Gang before, and but Grape was like from the towny side, and there were a lot of good bands coming out of that, you know, like the Jerks and SOS, like the initial punk bands, and the Explorers, actually, to give them credit, they begat the whole Leeds goth scene, like. Nearly everybody who played in the Sisters, the Mission, and all that played in the Explorers first. You know, they went through the Explorers, and you know, Wolfie, the whole lot, and they were the first band to be signed to Incredible Indie. They were signed to Zoo Records, you know, with Tear Up Explodes and all that. But somewhere along the way, they all got jobs and.
I've still got a job.
But he's got a good job. He works in the theatre. He's a lovely. But yeah, so the way I was saying, you know, in terms of balance, there were some very good bands coming out of the other side of Leeds.
Mm-hmm. Not the weird politicos.
Not the politicos, not the students, not that. There were just bands wanting to be famous and doing their bit.
Yeah, it's important not to maybe misrepresent the time. Because you said before, like, there were certain bands who were like, Leeds wasn't political, like, we weren't a political band, and then others were like,
well, you know, I mean, Paul was coming from the political. I never, you know, I've always looked at music as enjoyment, as fun, and I've always put on gigs with that. I put on gigs that I want to see, and sometimes I put some really naff gigs in because I think that'll be a laugh, you know, and then put them on, and I just do them for fun. I don't do them for any
But don't you think a lot of it got mixed up back then?
Oh yeah, it all got mixed up. You got them, you know.
We went to each other's clubs.
Yeah. No, you get the odd band, you know, that turn out to be NF affiliated or whatever. But you know, I think in those days, you know, there was too much made of the NF thing. It wasn't that big in Leeds, and there was.
It was very violent.
It wasn't that violent. You see,
it was.
I went to LP and they printed. Some kids got beat up by the NF and they printed the pictures. I said, you shouldn't be putting pictures because you're making the kids look like victims, and if they look like victims, the kids will be more prone to go towards the NF, so they won't get beaten up. And I think
I think there was a small number, but they were really violent, and that was the problem.
I don't think they were really violent because
they were hospitalised.
I had a black bouncer working for me called Eustace Richardson, who was also my friend as well. He used to go in town on Saturday, and if the National Front had a leaflet, he'd go and sort them out, just him on his own. You know, there was one time he sorted out 6 of them. You know, and it wasn't, you know, and I don't think...
Well, I wish you'd have sorted out the ones that got me. You know?
Yeah, but it was kind of like school type thing.
Well, wasn't there a night of Benton that was particularly lethal?
It was, you know,
It wasn't very pleasant.
Yeah,
I mean,
there were times, yeah, where there
was some very
areas.
Yes. I mean, where I agree with you is that a lot of the kids who called themselves whatever,
They were just
but there were a lot of organised here, though.
But there were behind that some very unpleasant.
There were people at the apple yards who were absolute bastards, a really violent family that just passed it down. And
they're just using that. You've got violent families now.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I have a great admiration for your club because you were one of the only places that will put on reggae bands in that period.
Yeah.
And lots of guys that I know used to come to and women used to come from Chapeltown to those gigs that you put on at a time when most black people would not come into the city centre because they were terrified in the night time particularly of being beaten up.
Yeah.
And at one of your gigs, a bunch of black people got massively beaten to shit by...
I don't think it was one of my gigs.
Races outside one of your gigs.
I'd never heard that one.
And there was a major battle.
Yeah.
And
which gig was it?
I don't know who the band was, but this is the story that's well told in Chapeltown. And then the following week, black guys came in mob-handed and won the battle. But that's
bollocks. It never happened. Honestly, I've got a good memory. I remember a lot of the gigs. That's just one of those legendary stories, like the Irish Centre myths. You know, there was an Irish Centre myth that all the lights would go out, and these hooded guys would come around with buckets. Never happened.
Well, I have spoken to men, black men who are now in their 50s, who talk about the particular battle that they had. The two.
If you can get me the name of the band or whatever, I can tell you. I've put everybody from Prince Farai to Black Slate to Steel Pulse to whatever, and we never had any bother. I had black bouncers, you know, big guys.
No, I'm not saying it happened in your club. I'm saying it happened as they were leaving your place. And the reason why I say this with some applause for you is that you at least put those bands on. But the corollary of it was that it was the beginning of the end of the fear that most young black people had of coming into the city centre in Leeds, because they then knew that if they came in strength, they would survive. So whether you think that this didn't happen,
well, I'm not saying it didn't happen. It's just I wasn't aware of it at the time.
But I'm also certain, and I'm just picking up this point about, you know, Leeds wasn't as bad as people make out. You will probably know that people in Chapeltown didn't really start coming into